All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us today, and welcome to our executive briefing, a cybersecurity guide for law firms. I'm Lee Hodgson, technology strategist with Rodin, and very excited to have Ashley Brown, head of technical services here at Rodin, with us today as well. So look, today we're not here to throw out, some of those big scary figures you might have heard about around, how many millions of dollars an imminent cyber attack is going to cost your firm. But what we are going to do is share with you some relevant insights to the legal service industry that's going to help you be more informed about what's actually going on in this space, and also help you to learn some actionable steps that you can immediately apply to strengthen your organization's cyber defenses. So with that, let's jump right in. So for us, being on the front line, we're seeing cybercrime affecting people from all different types of walks of life. But it's definitely hitting small businesses the hardest. So while these attacks on large companies and government agencies get the majority of news coverage, small businesses in general are more vulnerable to cyber criminals and are definitely suffering more proportionately from the results of cyber attacks. While it is true that smaller businesses may not be directly targeted in the same way, an Optus or Medibank may be, we're seeing attackers tend to cast a broader net, so it's more opportunistic, and it's that lack of expertise, that lacking of security operations staff, underinvestment in cybersecurity, and smaller IT budgets overall that we're seeing contributing factors to this level of vulnerability. Specifically for legal services industry, you're a high value target, and this is mainly due to the sensitive information that it's a high value to attackers that you have access to, but also from a supply chain perspective as well. So often with things we see around financial misdirection scams, you may not be the target, but you are because of the role that you play in those processes. So we want to go through a few real-world examples of some of the stuff that's happening out there. There's been a couple of high-profile breaches in the legal space of recent times. So last year there was HWL Ebsworth. What happened to them was there was a Russian-linked ransomware group who hacked a law firm back in April 2023, and what happened? They published initially about 1.1 terabyte of data that it had stolen, which was later turned out to be more like 3.6 terabytes of information. And initially, the way this came about was initially through ransomware. Rightfully so, the ransom was not paid, and then subsequently the data has been published. The responsible group for this was a group known as Black Cat, and they operate as a ransomware as a service product for hire. And they've been actively targeting organisations in Australia since sort of late 2021. And typically they look to exploit vulnerabilities in unpatched or outdated firewall or virtual VPN devices to break into networks, and which is likely how this came about for HWL. Now, for that organisation, HWL, it's had some pretty far-reaching impacts. So there's been something like 65 Australian government entities that have been impacted. These are their clients. One of them was including the National Disability Insurance Agency, and they've actually since had sensitive client information that's been caught up in that hack, so that's directly impacting some vulnerable people. And the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner is now investigating HWL's practices in relation to the security and protection of the personal information it held, as well as how they handled the notification of the data breach to the impacted individuals. Another one we've seen, which is quite targeted towards the industry. So there was a cybersecurity provider recently revealed it averted a major cybersecurity breach that targeted a local law firm. And they were using a highly targeted tactic known as SEO poisoning. So SEO poisoning is a method used by cyber criminals manipulating search engine results to direct users to malicious websites. So these are often cloaked in legitimacy to lure unsuspecting victims into downloading malware. What happened with this particular scenario was a solicitor who was in search of a legal precedent via Google came across a compromised link, believed it to be legitimate. They've then proceeded to download what appeared to be the relevant documentation, and then they've unwittingly risked the firm's entire network. Now, these compromised websites are engineered to increase their visibility on search engines, and then users are enticed into clicking on links that then download malicious scripts that are disguised as documents. And then upon execution, these typically sort of go down the path of downloading further malware, embedding persistent access mechanisms into the victim's device, and establishing communications with command and control servers for additional malicious actions. Fortunately, in this case, the hack was detected and contained by the firm's security monitoring team, which really speaks to the importance of having those detection and response capabilities in place. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to Ashley now. He's going to provide a bit deeper insight into the threat landscape and some of the known and unknown costs of a cyber incident for you all.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks for joining us, everyone. As Lee said before, my name's Ashley. I'm Head of Technical Services at Rodin. The example that Lee just mentioned, the HWL breach, was a ransomware attack. So ransomware does, believe it or not, still remain one of the top threat for small businesses, even today. Ransomware attacks are highly lucrative for cyber criminals. So, many small businesses are being forced to pay substantial ransoms to regain access to their data, and making them prime targets. Small businesses often lack, the extensive cybersecurity resources and expertise that, many larger organizations have. And it makes them more vulnerable to ransomware attacks because they're less capable to respond to those, types of attacks effectively. Ransomware attack can also cause significant downtime, operational downtime for small businesses. And that can lead to loss of productivity, loss of revenue. Again, that could be devastating for a small business. They are becoming more sophisticated. So cyber criminals are starting to use tactics like phishing, social engineering, and also exploiting vulnerabilities in software. So it's making it, harder for small businesses to defend themselves against, these types of attacks. And a lot of small businesses are holding sensitive customer data, and that may be subject to data protection regulations. As that ransomware attack can compromise this data, it can lead to legal and compliance issues as well as damaging reputation. So if you want to jump to the next slide for me, Lee. Something else that we're seeing, it's quite prevalent at the moment, or even more so at the moment, is business email compromise. It's not a new thing, and it is on the increase. There's a few different flavors of business email compromise, or BECs as they're commonly known. I think in 2024, business email compromise attacks made up 15% of total social engineering attacks, which is quite high. And Lee can attest to this. We've seen a sharp increase in business email compromise attacks, in the past 6 to 12 months. And business email compromise, basically, it's an attack where an attacker takes over an email account for the purpose of fraud, usually fraud and money theft. You've also got vendor email compromises, which is, I guess, another flavor of a business email compromise where a vendor or a customer's email is compromised. And although that's not particularly, not that organization's responsibility, they're involved in a transaction, for example, and that's how the breach occurs. So I just wanted to step through, I guess, the steps for a business email compromise. So usually an attacker will spoof a domain, and then try and impersonate a CEO or someone else important in the business. They usually, sending phishing emails, to high-risk employees in the organization, and their ultimate goal is to gain access to somebody's email account inside the organization. The user usually receives, an email, and falls for the attacker's attempt to phish them. And then that's where the damage occurs. Typically, like I said before, business email compromise, it's usually a financial incentive for the attacker. Fraud, trying to intercept bank account details for transactions. And they basically lay dormant in the email account for any number of days. We've seen up to 4 weeks, where an attacker's been inside a user's mailbox, learning how they communicate, and who they're communicating with, and then ultimately, either intercepting bank account details in a transaction or using the information that they've scraped from that user's mailbox to then do further attacks. And that ultimately leads in money loss. And like I said, you've got business email compromise and vendor email compromise. You've got it on both sides. So you've got compromises inside your own organization, but also outside of your organization. So we've seen examples that have been documented in the past where, as for an example, it's relevant to the legal sector, solicitors handling property transactions. Emails intercepted by an attacker, whether that was inside the organization or outside. And you've got solicitors that are doing high volumes of, property settlements and things like that. And there's big sums of money involved, and people losing serious amounts of money. So it's quite serious. It leads me into the next slide, which is, I'll just go back one, Lee. Just back. Yeah, sorry. Thanks. Yeah. The question you might ask yourself is, how does an attacker get access to an organization's account? You basically what's called a pass the cookie attack. So I'm going to step through and explain what this is. You might say, well, we have multi-factor authentication. How can an attacker get into our account? We have multi-factor turned on, and this is how. So we've seen a significant spike in takeover account scams in recent months. Basically, every session that you sign into, so whether you're signing into Office 365, signing into Xero, or an online platform, when you sign in with your credentials and you're prompted for MFA, and you successfully authenticate into that system, you are passed a session token, or what's commonly referred to as a cookie. And that gives you access to that platform for a preset amount of time. That could be 24 hours, that could be 72 hours, that could be a week. All depends on the system that you're logging into. What we're seeing happening right now is users are being phished. So they're receiving a phishing email from someone outside the organization, usually someone that has suffered a business email compromise. They're sent a link to a fake website. It might be an attachment with a link, or a link embedded in the body of an email. Takes them to a fake website. Usually it's in the flavor of they're trying to share a document with you. User clicks the link. It takes them to a website that looks legitimate, i.e. a Office 365 website or a Dropbox equivalent. The user enters their credentials, and the attacker basically steals the session token from the session. They then use that token and a number of tools on their end to basically gain access to the user's account, bypassing MFA. And they've obviously got their password because the user leaked their credentials. So yeah, that's a bit of an explanation about how that works, or how they're getting into those accounts. If you want to jump to the next slide for me, please, Lee. Next is the cost of a cyber incident. So if you jump to the next slide for me, Lee, this graphic is a great representation of, I guess, the known and hidden costs when you're going through a cyber incident or a ransomware attack, for example. It might seem obvious, the known costs. Obviously, in the diagram, tip of the iceberg, it's direct financial costs, including recovering assets, paying ransoms, insurance costs, all those things that I guess come with suffering a breach or an attack. And then you've got the hidden costs, which might not be so obvious. And you can see that at the water's edge, reputational damage. That's a massive one, including loss of clientele, loyalty, and overall reputation of the business. Then in the shallows, as the diagram suggests, you've got attrition costs as well. So I think a recent survey of organizations said over half of their workers would consider working for another business if their company that they work for had suffered a breach. So it's quite serious. And then deep waters, you've got extreme impacts as well. So becoming more common, like national security issues, cyber warfare, and believe it or not, even loss of life. So just on to the next slide. for me, Lee. And yeah, reputational damage. So this is a big one. 41% of CISOs and C-level executives named reputational damage as one of the biggest costs of their business following a cyber attack. And 34% agreed that loss of clientele was a significant cost. So yeah, massive impact, losing future business and future revenue from the business being at risk is quite serious. And some clients are even forced to terminate contracts early and things like that. So that obviously impacts revenue. And then the attrition rates, like I said, a recent study said 54% of workers considered working for someone else because their organization had suffered a cyber attack. So quite serious. 1 in 2, next slide for me, Lee. 1 in 2 C-level executives said they were breached in the last 12 months alone. And it was actually kept from their workers. And being breached is one thing, but keeping the workforce in the dark is another issue. That's it for me. I think pass over to you, Lee.
Thanks for that, mate. Thanks for sharing some of that insight. I guess aside from some of those costs that actually covered off on, there's also additional responsibilities for cybersecurity under the Corporations Act. There's the Notifiable Data Breaches Scheme and the Privacy Act. Some of this regulation is currently under review by the government, and I'll go into some of those proposed changes shortly. However, under the Corporations Act, directors must act with reasonable care and diligence, and so this includes things considering cybersecurity as part of their corporate governance roles. The Notifiable Data Breaches Scheme, so directors must ensure compliance with Notifiable Data Breaches Scheme, which requires organisations to promptly notify affected individuals and the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner about data breaches that are likely to result in serious harm. So penalties for failing to report a breach, they range from 2.5 million for individuals and up to 50 million for companies, or 30% of revenue. These were recently increased in 2022 following on from the Optus and Medibank breaches. And there's also the Privacy Act as well. So the Privacy Act has some clauses in there around directors who must ensure that their organisation comply with the Privacy Act, which includes obligations to protect personal information and report breaches. There's also a class action provision, and that provides a mechanism for compensation to be paid to victims of cybersecurity breaches. And then there's also the Australian cybersecurity strategy. So the government has a strategy in place now for managing cybersecurity for the nation, started back in 2020. They're considering stronger cybersecurity regulations and incentives to support the growing digital economy and respond to that growing threat environment as part of the Australian cybersecurity strategy. So some of the goals of that strategy are around setting clear cybersecurity expectations. So these will include things like standards and security minimums, increasing transparency. So businesses and households should have clear information about the security of technology products and service they use. But also around some mechanisms for small businesses to be able to award some sort of trust mark following assessment and compliance. The other thing focus is around protecting consumer rights through appropriate legal remedies for victims. There's also been, so the Attorney General's Department has completed a recent review of the Privacy Act, and it was 2 years in the making, and they've put forward 116 proposals that, if they are to be implemented, will be some of the most dramatic changes to the Australian privacy and data protection landscape since the initial introduction of the Australian privacy principles. And some of the key reforms proposed by the report. So out of that, there's 38 that have been agreed to already by the government. So these include some things like increased privacy protections for children and vulnerable individuals, strengthening security and data destruction obligations, but also greater powers for enforcement. In addition to these, there's another 68 that have been agreed to in principle. So some of the things that are covered off by those are around the removal of small business exemption and employee records exemption from the Privacy Act, a 72-hour notification requirement in relation to the notifiable data breach scheme. These reforms have been agreed to in principle by the government, but they still require some further consideration. And I believe the government has indicated that they're intending to introduce some updates to legislation sometime this year in 2024. But I guess that's enough of the doom and gloom and the scary stuff. The good news is that there is some really good guidance and best practice frameworks to assist law firms with developing an effective security strategy. And a lot of the things that we're talking about in these best practice frameworks are really, for the most part, quite foundational things that you can do, and they do have a significant impact on reducing risk. It's just that, for the most part, the things that we're doing 5 or even 3 years ago, they're just not enough today in today's environment. There's just a little bit more to it to be effective. So the Australian Signals Directorate's Essential 8 is a set of cybersecurity strategies that have been developed by the Australian Cybersecurity Centre to mitigate cyber threats. So they include things like, as you can see there, so application whitelisting, patching applications and vulnerability scanning, reviewing and restricting administrator privileges, patching, backing up, but also disaster recovery of testing. There's obviously a bit more to that as well. Now, the Australian government, through the Australian Signals Directorate, is recommending that all organisations adopt the Essential 8. For the legal industry specific, the New South Wales Law Society has put together some really great guidance for the industry. They recommend going a little bit further and incorporating cyber awareness training, so to better equip your employees to be able to notice if things don't look right, but also to help them recognise the role that they play in effective risk management for the organisation. On top of that, things like governance and procedures, particularly around payment processes, as well as incident response plans. So with the Essential 8, it's really good at setting a solid foundation and good at preventing breaches from happening. But we also need to plan for what happens during and after a breach. And we find incident response it's often pretty well overlooked, but crucial part in managing cyber risk. In the US, they have a framework which is called NIST. It's been widely adopted internationally. It does a really great job of laying out all of the components required for effective cyber risk management. So as you can see there, we've got the things that happen left of boom, so prior to a cyber attack. But then if a boom happens or a breach happens, it's also vital that organizations have a plan for what to do post-breach, and that's where your incident response comes in. So we have, before a breach happens, the things we do to identify what our information and IT assets are, the things that we do to protect those assets. So they're all the things that we do now around having endpoint access controls, multi-factor authentication. But then when we move into the right of boom stuff, that's where it gets a little bit more, complex. And it's around, well, how do we detect if there has been a threat? How do we know that we've been breached? And would we rather find out when our security monitoring and detection team notifies us, which is probably best case? Or is it when your bank account's been rinsed, which is not so good, or all of the contacts in your mailbox get sent out spam and phishing emails? So it's important in this day for firms to have a security operations center in place that are able to monitor and detect those security events and also contain them. This is usually not something that your IT support company or internal IT teams can do themselves. And then we talk about response and recover. So these are the things that we do to respond when a breach has happened, and how do we respond and recover and get back to business as usual. It's important that you have an up-to-date cyber incident response plan, and that answers all the questions that you're going to ask when you have a breach. Things like, what are we going to do? Who do we need to notify? And how do we notify them? So when you're going through a breach, it's really not the time that you want to be figuring this stuff out. It's a stressful enough time. So speaking about incident response and recovery, another piece that kind of fits in there is around cyber insurance, and it's something we get asked quite a lot, is kind of where that fits. So cyber insurance can be an important tool in managing cyber risk. Those policies will typically help you with the cost of business interruption or recovery. It'll include things like losses experienced that could be recovery costs related to the loss or damage of data, forensic investigation, remediation costs, the costs of engaging public relations advisors, and other professional services providers that you might need through that, or other losses that could be encountered by third parties. So a cyber insurance policy may help your organization to manage the consequences of the risk posed by cyber attacks, but it should be considered alongside other risk management practices like the development of a greater cyber risk management strategy, controls and regular risk assessments. It should be seen as that kind of last resort, and you definitely don't want to be testing the limits of your insurance policy and coverage there. They typically won't help with things like some of the things that Ashley spoke about before around reputational damage, whether that's to the firm or professionally, loss of market share, your competitive position in the market. And there's also some challenges going on in that space as well that's impacting law firms. So as we're seeing the number of attacks surge, so are the cost of premiums. There's more exclusions, and the standards being set by insurers to obtain or keep insurances are much higher. So you may have noticed significant increases in premiums, more stringent renewal conditions, or at least they're asking more questions. And typically the things that insurers are looking for are the controls and things we spoke about before around the Essential 8 and the NIST guidelines. And they're excluding more as well. So, it's really important to understand the fine print. They're limiting or excluding certain losses from cover, like ransomware events, or some wordings now limit the cover available for known vulnerabilities. So that could be a vulnerability in hardware or software that's reached end of life, or there could be a patch or fix that's available that hasn't been applied. So you really want to make sure that your IT is looking after these things, patching systems, doing vulnerability management to identify these vulnerabilities before they become a breach. Another thing to be aware of is that insurers will not pay out if you're misrepresenting on your forms. So it's really crucial to involve the right parties when you're filling out those applications or renewals. Make sure there are no misrepresentations that could be something that has changed on the network, or maybe not quite understanding the controls that you actually have in place, and making sure you haven't overlooked anything if you're filling it out on behalf of HR or IT, as insurers could limit or deny your coverage there as well. So the really quick run through there. We've obviously been through a fair bit pretty quickly. I'd say the biggest threat to you guys today is around complacency and inaction. And the best thing that you can do today is to be more informed about where your firm stands in relation to the current standards we discussed today. Don't assume that your IT has this covered for you. Now, what we do at Rodin is we actually take firms like yours through this journey every day towards cyber resilience, and often that journey starts with a risk assessment. So the benefits of going through that risk assessment will help you get a good understanding of risk in the organisation that's objective without bias. We'll give you insurance that there are no gaps or mistakes that have been overlooked, and also supports your decision making around what risks do we need to prioritise and mitigate in the future. For those of you that are attending with us today, we are providing a limited number of base level risk assessments that will be performed by one of our experienced assessors at no cost. So if you are interested in that engagement, we will be sending out some information about how to engage Rodin for that risk assessment. But also I want to talk about, with the stakes being so high and cybersecurity becoming increasingly complex to manage, what we can do at Rodin is we can actually come in and complement your existing IT team with a managed cybersecurity service. So that allows them to focus on the stuff they're good at around IT support responsibilities, and then we can take on the handling of cybersecurity. So what we can do is alignment for your organization around the Essential 8 and NIST as a managed service. We're also delighted to have recently launched our secured managed IT service. So one of the things we are firm believers here at Rodin is that modern legal firms need a lot more than just day-to-day IT support and upkeep. So we've really redefined how we deliver managed IT services with a security-first approach that integrates those best practice cybersecurity controls we spoke about, as well as strategic enablement, all embedded into the core of our service. So if you would like to know a little bit more about any of those particular services, please feel free to reach out to us. Otherwise, if there are any questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A. We've got about a minute or so left. All right, so it doesn't look like we've got any today, but perhaps if you feel like you might want to ask something offline, I'm more than happy for you to reach out with those contact details provided. Otherwise, oh, we do have one that's come through. So what can you all do to help business prevent business email compromises? So there's obviously a few different parts to that. You've got your user awareness thing. So it's about improving users' awareness of how to spot these suspicious things and how to behave and react and report them. But there are also things that should be done in the background to prevent or limit the reach if there is an account compromise. And importantly, we spoke about before about being able to detect if there has been a threat in your environment. So often if you haven't got the appropriate layers in place, you could have an account that has been compromised. They've used the cookie thing that Ashley spoke about before to bypass multi-factor authentication. They can be sitting there lurking in that environment for many days or weeks before you actually know about it. So ideally what you want to have in place is that security operations center we spoke about before. They do the detection and response service for you, so they can actually pick up on some of the things that are happening in your environment that you wouldn't otherwise notice. Otherwise, thank you all for joining us today, and like I said, we will be in touch with some further resources and a recording of this as well if you wish to revisit it or share it with anyone else in your firm. Thanks again.